Hi everybody, and welcome to the lockdown lectures here at Goldsmiths. Today I'm going to be talking to you about urban sensing and creative practice. And so I can see lots of people arriving. Great for you to be joining us here. So my name's Helen Pritchard. I'm a lecturer in computational art in the Department of Computing at Goldsmiths, where I also lead a program that's called Digital Arts Computing. So today I'm going to talk about some of the collaborative work that I've done with Citizen Sense. We are a collective who have been investigating environmental sensing technologies and citizen engagement. And in particular, what I'm going to talk to you about is a project called Urban Sensing, where we worked with communities in Deptford in order to look at some of the issues around air quality and to work with those communities in order to think about how we might monitor air quality, how we might make kits to do that, and also how we might kind of move that into some type of political action and political agency. I just want to say before I start that this work is done together with Jennifer Gabrice, who's also the PI of Citizen Sense, and also together with Dr. Lara Houston, who was one of the co-researchers with me on this project. So what is citizen sensing? So citizen sensing is an everyday practice which engages with mobile, open hardware and digital technologies. Hey everyone that's arriving there on the chat, thanks for coming. In particular, Citizen Sense is a project which is interdisciplinary. So it's a project which is across digital media, science and technology studies, and creative practice. In the project, we use practice-led methods for researching sensing technologies and to work with environmental engagement across pollution and urban and wild sensing. Really kind of key to this work, and I'm just flicking back to that slide there, is our approach to technologies is very much a trans-feminist technoscience approach. And so by that I mean that we bring feminist practices into working with technology. And this is also very much informed by a kind of DIY approach to sensing our environment. So for us, it's about thinking how we might take up these tools, how we might work with communities in a kind of do-it-yourself approach. And at the same time, the project also investigates and inquires into the kind of proliferation of DIY sensing devices. So some of you might actually have a sensing device at home. You might probably all have one in your pocket. So your smartphone, you know, there's many, many different types of sensors on that. But how can we kind of think in a more of a do-it-yourself way, in a way in which we might kind of develop these technologies ourselves? And this practice is very much informed by also thinking about the ways in which the environment is a feminist issue, the types of kind of eco-feminist practices, you know, from allotments through to the types of citizen sensing that we're engaged with. Alongside that, you know, we see this as very much coming up from a kind of a DIY zine culture that kind of went into developing open source softwares, doing software activism, doing DIY practices. And so instead of kind of seeing the genealogy of urban sensing as coming from something perhaps more Silicon Valley based, you know, for us, we want to think about these kind of histories, these long histories of activists, artists, academics, environmental scientists working together. So I'm going to talk through some of the Deptford Data Stories project that we did, in particular the monitoring that we undertook in Deptford and New Cross. So I'm just going to move over to our Citizen Sense data stories to give you a bit of an introduction to them. So from late October in 2016 to early September in 2017, the Citizen Sense Research Project collaborated with residents of South East London to develop a citizen-led air quality monitoring project. Residents in this area were particularly concerned about air quality levels, and in particular in relation to road transport and construction. So some of you might be from Deptford, or you might be living in the area close to Goldsmiths, and you will have noticed that there's a lot of construction that's been taking place in that area and throughout really the whole of London over the past years. And so the communities in Deptford had already begun to undertake monitoring in this area and different types of community activities in relation to this monitoring for environmental pollutants. And so some of the sites that we were monitoring, some of them are down by the Deptford Creek, and kind of like thinking through the ways in which environmental pollution and also some of the issues around housing and equality in London might be tied together. And so these were some of the discussions that we were having together with the residents whom we were working with on the project. And so we got together in 2016 and we thought together about how to develop a kind of infrastructure or a set of sensing and monitoring practices that could actually start to account for the air pollution that was being potentially caused by the construction industries, but also by the road transport in that area. So some of you might know that London suffers from a very poor air quality, and particulate matter 2.5 is really one of the key pollutants of concern when we think about air quality and air pollution. And so there's a huge monitoring network in London run by the London Air Quality Network that does monitor for particulate matter 2.5. But actually there aren't very many stations in Deptford or in that area. So although this construction was taking place, there's kind of the huge roads that run through there, it's quite difficult to get a picture of what's actually happening in the areas of Deptford and New Cross in relation to the pollution from particulate matter. And so together with around 35 community members, we worked to develop a monitoring kit that we called the Dust Box. And the Dust Box is a sensor, it's a kind of custom sensor kit. It's also a kit that kind of takes into concerns some of the discussions we might be having around privacy and surveillance in order to think about how we might do environmental monitoring differently. So as I was saying before, instead of thinking about how this might be a kind of exploitative project which exploits and accumulates data in perhaps a model we might see in Silicon Valley, within the Dust Box project, we really started to try to think about what would it mean for communities to own these data sets and to be able to work with them themselves. So alongside the Dust Box kit, we also developed a monitoring platform called AirSift. And that platform allows citizens to be able to look at the data that's collected on air pollution from the Dust Box and to be able to look at that in real time and compare it to historical data. So alongside the Dust Box, which I'm going to talk a bit more about in a minute, the AirSift platform, which is a platform for analysing data, we also developed something we called the logbook. And the logbook is a set of instructions for monitoring, but also a kind of set of practices for recording observations. So the types of things that actually a sensor itself might not be able to capture. So for example, we asked residents together, with residents, we thought about the things, the experiences of pollution. So that might be things like smells, it might be noises, it might be that you're kind of walking down the street to the shops and you see that there's kind of huge amounts of dust covering the road. It might be that you've observed that there are kind of 3 or 4 trucks coming daily to the construction sites around you. So together with these elements, we were able to paint quite a strong picture of the experiences of pollution within the urban environment in Deptford. And so these kits were distributed through Deptford, and together we together, people put those kits in their homes. And then we had a number of events, including workshops and walks. You could also at the time check out these kits from the Deptford Lounge Library. So in total, there was about 30 monitors and logbooks that were in circulation at any time. And it was quite easy to access them from the library and to take them into your home and start to monitor. So I'm going to move over and show you a couple of pictures of these dust box kits in action. And so, as you can see, the dust box itself is quite a simple kit. It's there to monitor, in particular, particulate matter 2.5. And we work very closely with our very friendly atmospheric scientist, Benjamin Barrett, who's here in the background. And this is us over at the London Air Quality Network calibrating these kits. So thinking about the ways in which they might be able to align and give evidence next to the London Air Quality Network. So thinking about some of these questions around accuracy, or what we called what might be a kind of just good enough, what might be just accurate enough as a type of data about pollution to be able to tell a story, to be able to tell a data story in particular. And so residents set these dust boxes up in their homes, and they live with them for about a period of 6 months. And of course, as they're a DIY technology, right, they needed a lot of fixing and repair, and this became quite a big part of the project itself. So from the data that was collected, there were a number of key findings. So after we had all kind of worked together, after people had had these dust boxes and these monitoring kits in their homes, there was a kind of quite a large data set that developed, and that allowed us together with the communities to really look at this data and try and understand the air quality picture in Deptford, the types of pollution that we see there. And so there were some kind of key findings in this data which hadn't really been shown before for the Deptford area. So in particular, we saw that the traffic intersections have significantly higher pollutant levels. And in some places, we kind of estimated they might be almost 6 times higher than the World Health Organization would recommend. And through looking at the data and looking at the experiences that were logged together with the data that the dust boxes collected, we were able to see that the higher particulate matter levels were made worse by the construction activity, especially the construction-related traffic which would come through those areas of Deptford. Another really interesting finding when we started to look at the data was that actually there was an indication that pollution data showed was that the River Thames itself was a possible emission source in some areas. So there's a lot of heavy traffic up and down the River Thames, and that in itself is contributing to some of the air pollution in the Deptford area. But another really interesting observation that came up through one of the data stories and looking at these different data sets was that actually urban design can make a really significant and positive difference to prevent and mitigate pollution. And we saw that in a number of areas, particularly kind of dense gardens and areas where there were kind of green spaces, that they did actually kind of mitigate the pollution. And so this was a big key finding, and that actually led to a number of actions that then the communities undertook together. So if you're interested to read more about these data stories, you can check them out on the Citizen Sense website, which I'm showing you now. So just to take you through the different stories. So there's one in Deptford Park. In the Deptford Park story, there was kind of clear evidence of the primary sources of PM 2.5 coming from the road traffic, coming from that HGV traffic. And emission levels were most likely made worse there through the construction activity and construction-related traffic in the area. And in particular, one of the stories was based at New Cross Gate, where there's a very well-planted community garden. And in this story, we show how in this area, within this garden, it really did create a kind of haven that could mitigate against the pollution coming from the road traffic and coming from the surrounding construction. And so, as I said, this then led to a number of community actions in relation to this. So, having seen that there was a kind of body of evidence that the citizens had collected, they then we came back together as a group, and we looked at ways in which to work with this data. So, how could this data, how could the project actually start to generate a type of political action, a political agency in which communities could actually make that data actionable and make changes within their lived environments and their everyday experiences. And so in particular, a group whom we were working with, Deptford folk, they planted 200 trees in response to some of the findings in the Citizen Sense report as a way to start to think about mitigating that air pollution. Another thing that the communities did is they took this data up and they took it into some of the political discussions around how Deptford itself is being developed. So some of this data was taken by the MP Vicky Foxcroft and debated in Parliament. So if you think that this is a kind of citizen data, it's a DIY data, it's data that we collected using monitors that we built together using quite low cost and DIY technologies. Some of the things in which students will be using, for example, in our Hatch lab at Goldsmiths. So the monitor uses a kind of Arduino-based sensor kit. It uses quite a cheap particulate matter sensor. But even so, through using this in a spatial and temporal way, we were able to show in evidence that was actually good enough to be taken to Parliament that there were high levels of pollution in the Deptford area, and sometimes that pollution was 6 times the recommended limit. And so, as well as taking that data to Parliament to be debated, it was always also a way to kind of circulate that finding, to share actually the people's experience of pollution in Deptford was much higher than in other parts of London. And to think about, so the World Health Organization has a particular limit of particulate matter that they see as being healthy for communities. And so the communities together, by collecting this data, were able to actually highlight that the levels of construction in the city, in this area, were taking that healthy limit of particulate matter way over the limit. And they were able then to use that data to call on their MPs, to call on the local councillors, to call on the government to actually put in mitigating effects and to take seriously their own local community plans for how they want Deptford to develop as a place to be living in and as a place for kind of sustainable well-being. And so I'd like to thank some of the, as I said in the beginning, this is a project that is in collaboration with Citizen Sense. It's led by Jennifer Gabrice and is together with Lara Houston and also all of the community groups in Deptford who collaborated on the project. Okay, so I'm going to go and I'm going to see if there's any questions now appearing on the YouTube channel. And I thought that we could kind of maybe perhaps go into a discussion about urban sensing, and perhaps you have some questions in relation to some of the ways in which we've been working. Okay, so one of the questions was, how did we recruit the citizen participants? Thanks, that's a really great question. So one of the ways in which we work in Citizen Sense is that we don't necessarily perhaps even think about that in terms of recruiting, right? So there's, often we might talk about kind of a recruiting a participant group. But instead, one of the really important methods in citizen sense has been to look for places where there is already activity happening around environmental issues. So, for example, we did a project in Pennsylvania where we worked with citizens who'd been affected by pollution from fracking infrastructure. And the way in which that project started was really by looking for kind of pockets of activity that was taking place. So perhaps people were already making indie films in order to show their experiences of pollution. Or perhaps they were already starting to try to do some environmental monitoring or doing that quite successfully. So the same really in Deptford is that we saw that there were already a number of groups who were interested in thinking about like the kind of role that green spaces might play in their communities. There were also groups of activists who were very concerned about the amount of construction that was happening, and together with other groups who had already been engaged with air quality monitoring. So some of those groups had done things like traffic counts and analog monitoring. And so really part of our method for getting together with participants to collaborate with them is actually starting by inviting people together to start a discussion and then to work together. So not necessarily always thinking that you need to start from something to kind of generate something in a space where there isn't political activity already, but actually to work with those energies, to work with those creative energies that are already there. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the next question. So a similar question, I guess, is the ways in which we involve the community and how we found people to take part. So I guess I've said a bit about that, but I can carry on talking about that. So one of the ways I think in which citizen sensing and citizen monitoring often grows is that in projects such as ours, there is a kind of and networks are grown through different ways. So that might be through people in the project bringing in other people that they know. So a lot of participants might start on the project and then they might actually themselves have quite a rich network of friends, family, and other collaborators who they want to get involved in monitoring. But in the Deptford Urban Sensing Project, I guess one of the really significant things we did was to set up also the library loaning scheme. So there we could, in the library, anybody could go and check out the dust box. So if somebody was kind of remotely interested in getting involved in this air quality project, all they needed to do was to go to their local library, and there was a kit that they could check out with instructions of use. And through that, they could then come to get in touch with us. Okay, so another question. How did we collectively handle, store and work with the data generated? And did we agree on a set of standards and acceptable uses? Okay, great. Thanks, Gwen, for that question. So one of the important, I guess, things in the project, one of the ways in which we've worked in quite a few of our projects is thinking very carefully about the data that's collected. So when we worked in Pennsylvania on the pollution sensing, one of the first things we saw when we were working there was that many people had been part of science projects in the past to monitor air quality, but that data often hadn't been returned to them. So they had been doing perhaps water samples, or they had been taking air samples, but they hadn't really had a kind of ownership of that data. So really from the beginning was a kind of key agreement that the data that was generated was shared, was a kind of seen as a community resource rather than perhaps as like a commodity to be extracted and sold, or just simply as something like a data source to write academic papers. And so instead we want to see this as a shared community resource. But of course that does come with many issues, because many of the kind of systems that are set up for us to share, collect and share data on are actually very much systems which are maybe linked into Google, are running on Amazon servers. And so it's very difficult to get outside of that ecology. And so one of the things we did was actually to build a lot of our own infrastructure. in order to store the data. And taking into account that some of that data also might be sensitive. And so some of the acceptable uses or not, that was very much an emerging set of standards that often would respond to the context. So in some cases, those discussions would actually kind of have to happen during the data being generated. So often on projects, the way in which environmental data might be collected is that it's collected, it's analysed, and then it's released as a story. But in our project, because of the urgency of some of these situations, but also because people were then kind of handling this data and living with these monitors in their houses, obviously there was a need to kind of respond in a much quicker way and for people to be able to analyse that data and to be able to share that data as it was being made, so a kind of data in the making. And so some of the uses, the kind of acceptable uses, were often agreed between community members. So, for example, at points, some of that data would have a completely open license. And at other points when we needed to protect that data from uses that we didn't things we didn't want that data to be used for, then we would actually have to think about other sets of licenses to be attached to that data. But I guess the key thing is really thinking about the way in which that data might be experienced differently as well within different communities and used in different ways. So, for some communities, for some citizens that we work with, that data was really important in thinking about the green spaces, and for others in lobbying the construction companies. But maybe you have more questions on that. Okay, so I see as well there's another question from Vera. So I might be interested in working with air quality data. I wonder what kind of data you're able to get with dust boxes. I know that the air quality data network gives data as levels versus numeral values. Okay, so so obviously so you can actually get through the London Air Quality Network, you can actually access numeric values if you kind of delve into that data a bit closer. So where I think on their kind of main website they'll show like the different levels of pollution using almost like a traffic barcoding scheme. You can actually, using some of their tools, generate graphs to see much more detailed data. And in that way, the London Air Quality is a really quite fantastic resource in showing the kind of different localised and kind of citywide air pollution events that are taking place. In our dust box, we were generating a data that was it was measuring particulate matter, and we did translate that into a unit, so you could see that the number, whether that was like 20 micrograms or 30 micrograms or 10, and the way that we did that is that we calibrated them at the London Air Quality Network to understand the data that was being read by the sensor and how to translate that into a unit that then could be measured against things like the World Health Organization standards. And so the way in which the particulate matter sensor works that we were using is it's a kind of light scattering sensor. It takes in air into the chamber and it looks at the density of those particles as it shines the light through them. And so the reading that the sensor generates is based on that density, and then you're able, if you've locally calibrated, to then generate a unit number of particulate matter 2.5 from that. And there were some ways in which we were able in our data analysis tool to then compare that data against the local air quality stations as well. And so Vera, I think looking at the ways in which different sensors generate different readings and how you can then kind of map or translate them onto units if that's what you're interested in working with, is really a kind of process of local calibration, because it's very difficult for a sensor to come out of the box and for it to be able to give a reading that's relevant to the particular particulate matter in the area that you're working. Okay, so I see there's a question from Larissa. Great, so can you tell more about how the data was analysed? So the data that we collected, we actually developed this platform which is called the AirSift platform for the data to be analysed on. And that means that whereas normally perhaps that data analysis practice might be something that the data scientists do or the atmospheric scientists do, by developing this citizen platform, it meant that the people who were generating the data, the communities that we were working with, were able to actually undertake some of that data analysis itself. And the reason that we developed this platform is that when we were working actually on the pollution sensing project in Pennsylvania, we were working with a number of community members, and they started to see patterns in their data. And we were collecting this data, and we were, all thinking that we would then kind of, after we had collected that data, analyse it and take a look together, probably doing that analysis offline. But we found that actually, the people that we were working with actually wanted the tools to be able to do that data analysis themselves. And actually, because they were there on the ground, they were having those experiences, it was actually, there was a whole kind of set of knowledge and evidence and experiences that they were able to bring that actually enabled them to really think about, well, I want to, for example, on the 5th of March, there was a particular pollution event that I noticed. And so I want to be able to analyse that. And so we developed the AirSift toolkit in order for citizens to be able to do that. And for them to be able to actually, to be able to work with the data and to look at the patterns that were emerging. One of the really useful things, and one of the things that makes the AirSift platform really suitable for analysing air quality data, is that the platform itself is based on a fantastic library which was developed by King's, and that library is specialised for analysing air quality data. And then we worked together with Benjamin Barrett at King's to develop a kind of our data story structure. And actually, if you look at the data stories, you can there see how we kind of set about a kind of number of protocols in which communities could analyse the data. So in a way, we looked at what might be an atmospheric scientist process when they are working with data, when they're taking it into some of these platforms for graphing and analysing it. And so we kind of looked at how to develop that into a set of instructions that then people could work through in order to analyse the data and see if there was a pollution event in their area or if there was a kind of ongoing pollution story. And so importantly in the data stories, you'll see that we bring that quantitative data together with the qualitative data, those kind of on-the-ground experiences that people had, which might be, for example, in Deptford, witnessing large amounts of construction, and then being able to put that together with a chart which shows that when the wind was blowing from the north, there was kind of higher levels of particulate matter, which might show that it's a localised pollution event. So what was really important was the kind of linking together of all of these different data sets. So the particulate matter sensing data from the dust box, together with temperature, together with wind, together with location, and together with some of this qualitative and experiential data. Okay, so that was a very long answer, but I'm going to look at the next question. So just wondering, where are these green spaces? Some of the spaces that we kind of identified in the data stories as being of kind of immense importance of creating mitigating effects of pollution. So one of them is a community garden, which is in New Cross Gate. It's actually quite a small space, but it's a very kind of shielded and well-planted area. But some of the people who we were also working with were working in some of those green spaces, such as Folkestone Gardens in Deptford, and some of the other kind of green areas when you move across from New Cross into Deptford. And so really the data kind of shows the importance in many of those spaces as actually mitigating the effects from air quality pollution. Great, well thanks so much for those questions. If you'd like to take a look, you can take a look through each of those data stories. You can look at how the data was analysed, the stories in which they told, and the ways in which they then fed into communities being able to take action. Okay, so next week it's James Owen Jan, and he is going to be talking about digital privacy, so actually quite relevant kind of follow on, I guess, from the Citizen Sense work. Digital privacy, what is it and who needs it anyway? And that'll be Wednesday, 10th of June at 2 p.m. Taking place here on the YouTube channel. And if you've got any other questions, you can email me and I can give you more information, or you can also follow me on Twitter. Great. So thank you for joining today. And great, yeah, bye. And I look forward to talking more with you all about citizen sensing and how artists and designers can actually kind of generate new urban practices around data.